Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the Nikon Z-mount version of Viltrox's exciting new 85mm f2 EVO lens. The EVO lineup, of course, is their newest lineup, joining the Air series on the bottom end and then the Pro and Lab series on the higher end. And the EVO slits between the Air and the Pro series, giving you some of the feature set of the Pro series, but the smaller, lighter, and cheaper variation of the Air series. It's a really sweet balance, and I love the 85mm f2 EVO on Sony E-mount. So today's review is a follow-up for those of you that are Nikon Z-mount users to see if it is as good and as useful here on Nikon. And I would say that the most obvious competitor is going to be Nikon's own 85mm f1.8s. And then of course there is the older, and in fact the oldest of Viltrox's autofocusing lenses, which is the 85mm f1.8, which is still sold here on Z-mount. Now, the 85mm f1.8 is considerably larger and heavier, nearly double the weight of this lens, a little bit more expensive, and frankly not quite as good, though it does have very nice rendering. It's a nice lens optically, but the EVO series is next level when it comes to features and general performance. And then of course, compared to that S-line lens, the S-line lens is considerably more expensive. So for those of you that are interested in having a compact 85mm telephoto lens and don't want to spend the money of the S-line lens, I think that this could be really interesting. That is, if it holds up in performance. Now, in full disclosure, this lens was sent to me by Viltrox for evaluation. As always, however, they have had no input in my review process, and they will not see this video before you do. My thoughts are my own, and this is a completely independent review. Let's dive in and check it out. Okay, let's dive in. Let's take a closer look at the build and the feature set here. I really like the formula that Viltrox has struck with this brand new EVO series, in that I feel like it kind of combines some of the best of both worlds. We've got the more compact size of the Air series, a little bit bigger than that, and we've got most of the feature set of the Pro series, just a little bit less, but in a lens size that is going to be really attractive, and particularly here on Z-mount, where there's not a lot of high-performing compact lenses quite like this. I think it's going to be a really excellent fit. The build quality here is actually really quite beautiful. I would be hard-pressed to tell you that the S-line f1.8 lenses are better made than what this lens is. It does feel very well made. It doesn't have maybe as thorough of weather sealing. It does have a gasket at the lens mount and a coating on the front element. What it doesn't have is the internal seals that the S-line lenses will have, but at least it does have some measure of weather sealing, and so you're not going to feel like you're making your camera vulnerable by mounting it on there because of that gasket there. Most of the competitors here really, and there's not a ton on Nikon, it's going to be a couple of f1.8 competitors in the S-line lens, which is considerably more expensive, and then also Viltrox's older 85 f1.8, which you can get for about $329. The S-line lens is, it's up in the $800 range, and so considerably more expensive. There's also, of course, the Sirui Aurora 85mm f1.4. It's right under $500, but obviously it's an f1.4 lens with both the good and the bad that comes with that in terms of the overall size, weight, but then also, of course, light gathering potential. What we do have relative to the earlier Viltrox and then of course the S-line lens is a bit more feature set here. For one thing, we do have a dedicated aperture ring, which is great. And so you have both an aperture and a manual focus ring, which means that you get away from, on the S-line lens, having just a single customizable control, which means you can either have aperture control or you can have, full-time manual focus override, but you can't have both. And so I really like this configuration because you can have both. And what's more, you can have the option of having clicks. You can declick it with a switch on the side, and so you can do smooth aperture racks. While there isn't an iris lock, there at least is a firm detent there at f16 that should keep you from going into the automatic mode if you have any kind of sensitivity in your hands. It will also have a customizable button here on the side, which you can program a function in from the camera body. Again, that's something that's missing on the S-line lens or the older Viltrox lens, and you're getting all of that in a much more compact package, which I love. We've got 9 rounded aperture blades here, and you can see you can do smooth aperture racks, which is useful, and it retains a fairly circular shape as you stop it down there. Geometry is pretty good as well. The lens does come with a nice lens hood here, which frankly feels just as good, if not better, than what I find on the S-line lenses, which their hoods are nothing special. This is nice. It's just plastic, but it's nice, thick. It feels tough and durable. It clicks into place with a nice amount of precision, and it's not going to break away from that. The lens itself, it's a big winner in terms of the size here. So 69 millimeters in diameter, or 2.71 inches. That's about 6 or 7 millimeters slimmer than the competing lenses. It is 78 millimeters long, or around 3 inches. And again, the competitors are going to run anywhere between 96 and about 103 millimeters in length. So the 78 millimeters makes it much shorter. So it's both slimmer and shorter, and it is lighter, 360 grams or 12.6 ounces. The S-line lens is 470 grams, so 110 grams more. The older Viltrox 85 f1.2 is a whopping 540 grams. So that's an extra 180 grams. So that is a huge advantage for this lens if you're wanting to travel light. Up front, we've got 58 millimeter filter threads, which are small and common. And on the rear, we do have a USB-C port, and so that you can do easy firmware updates. I did a firmware update on this today. There is an update to, I believe, version 1.05, and the update process took all of about 4 or 5 seconds. And so very, very quick, gets the job done, no problems there. Minimum focus distance is 74 centimeters. That's a little bit better than some competing lenses, and the magnification of 0.13 times is not great in absolute sense, but for an 85 millimeter lens, that's actually a good performance. And so the highest I've seen on an 85 non-macro style lens is just 0.14 times. And so this is right in the hunt there. So a usable amount of up-close performance, and the up-close sharpness and contrast is fairly good. And so at the end of the day, this is a beautiful package. Nice build quality, nice feature set, and great size. So let's talk autofocus. Focus motor here is an STM focus motor, and while they have moved to the Hyper VCM voice coil style motors on the Pro and the Lab series, they have retained the STM focus motor here, and frankly, it's probably all that is needed. The Air series and the Evo series are using smaller maximum apertures, so smaller glass elements, and thus STM provides plenty of thrust. As you can see here, focus moves back and forth with good speed, not really hardly any hesitation there at all, and I would say that focus speed is certainly up to the competing lenses from Nikon that also are driven with STM focus motors. Frankly, everything in this class of lens, all the 85 millimeter lenses that are basically available on Z-mount are utilizing STM focus motor at this point, and so no problems there. That all seems to work out without any kind of issue. I also found that I had good accuracy, whether I was shooting photos of people, shooting photos of animals, and in general, I felt like focus worked fine. And so I don't really have any kind of hesitations. Focus motor is quiet in operation, not really any kind of focus noise, definitely nothing you would ever get picked up on the microphone of a camera. And so in general, I think the focus gets the job done, and it seems to translate well to Nikon here. I feel like it has good confidence for a third-party lens. It did feel pretty natural and pretty Nikkor-ish in terms of the focus quality, so that's all I can ask for, particularly in a lens that is so inexpensive like this. All right, let's talk video autofocus. I find on Nikon, you have to put a little bit more effort into making sure that you tweak the settings to get the kind of behavior you want out of video. With Sony, you can pretty much go with the defaults most of the time, Canon, and it'll get the job done. But Nikon, you need to be a little bit more specific, and I find that for myself, I really need to max out the sensitivity if I want focus to move with any kind of alacrity. Now, when it comes to touch to focus, unfortunately, none of those settings apply to that process. And so while the Viltrox does fairly well here, bouncing back and forth with a pretty good amount of confidence. It's nothing that I would call cinematic, and that's true for all the lenses that I test here. However, if I shift to other things, like, for example, let's look at the test of approaching the camera. All right, let's see how it does when I approach the camera. This kind of test is getting less and less fun as winter has now arrived. So we'll see if I can keep this up in the future all winter long, but at the moment, we're still getting it done. All right, let's see what happens if I duck out of frame to see if it actually goes to the background. And more importantly, does it come back to me? How about if I go to the side? And back in frame. We'll see how quickly it snapped back there. You can see in this case that because I've turned that sensitivity up, it did actually start to transition towards the background, whereas on some of my reviews, if I don't change that setting, it kind of just waits around for me to come back. And so I was happy to see that it was fairly responsive, but more importantly, it was accurate in both tracking me as I approached and then also picking me back up when I stepped out of frame. Likewise, it did fairly good when I did my hand test and making good transitions from my hand to my eye and back. What I also notice in that is that there is some focus breathing, but it is not particularly jarring or rough. Likewise, if I do just a standard transition where I'm not doing any kind of touch to focus, just allowing focus to naturally shift from a foreground subject to the background, I found that it did that with a pretty nice degree of damping. No. And so the most important thing to me there is that it is a smooth process, and thus you could use this fairly cinematically. Now, obviously for all these outdoor settings where I have been filming with the lens itself, the key thing there is that it is trustworthy when it comes to tracking me. I would have no hesitation using this for some of my video segments, and that is really, at the end of the day, what matters most to me. So overall, I would give it a thumbs up for its performance. So let's talk about the optical performance. This is an optical design of 10 elements in 8 groups. That's 2 extra low dispersion elements and 2 high refractive index elements as a part of that design. You can see that the MTF looks great in the center and the mid frame, and then there is some drop right off towards the edge where it drops somewhat at the f8 test, which it shows it's a little bit less sharp in the center of the frame but more even across the whole frame, giving you consistent results for things like landscapes. I've already tested this on a higher resolution level, and so I already know it's a high performing lens. So I've tested it at 61 megapixels here on Nikon at 45 megapixels. It's a little less demanding, and I did find that things like corner sharpness seem to sharpen up more quickly, in my opinion, on the low resolution point. This is a lens that has a lot of good things going on. It's got a minimal amount of distortion. I used a -2 to correct a bit of pincushion distortion. Vignette, has surprised me in that it wasn't, still has a fair bit of vignette, but it wasn't noticeably heavier on Nikon than what it was on Sony. In my Sony test, I needed a +71 to correct. Here on Nikon, I needed a +76. So, you know, a tiny amount of additional correction, but remarkably similar. Usually I'm seeing at least a full stop. I also just found in the overall design, it seems like this kind of form factor seems like it had to be less modified for Z-mount as well. So I really like, this is a really effective port relative to the Sony version, which I'm really glad to see. It continues to have very low levels of fringing, so very strong in terms of longitudinal style chromatic aberration, a very minimal amount there. I saw that both on my test chart, but then also in the real world shot of my dad's old SLR. I also found minimal amounts of lateral style chromatic aberration, so great. Wide open performance with crops at f2 and here shown at 200% magnification show an extremely sharp center, very strong mid frame, and then still surprisingly good corners. I found that stopping down to f2.8, you can see a bit of improvement in the corners. By f5.6, they are pin sharp. They're sharp in a way actually that not a lot of lenses get to, so I was impressed by that. Diffraction is going to show up a bit at f11 and then more noticeably by f16, but again, not quite as extreme on Nikon as it was on Sony due to that lower resolution level there. Now, this lens has a lot of wide open pop, so it does actually remind me of the f1.8 S-line lenses in that regard. And like those lenses, I feel like the rendering is still quite good when you consider the fact that they are so sharp and contrasty wide open. And so when you're close to your subject and the background's a little bit further away, obviously you can get a beautiful amount of background blur. But where this lens stands out for an f2 lens is that I feel like the rendering is really quite good in the less advantageous situations. Basically, there was no place where I saw the bokeh get ugly in my mind. And, you know, it's got some of that clipping in the corners in terms of the geometry for specular highlights, but that's true of almost all lenses, and particularly telephoto lenses. It's very, very true. You know, anything short of the plena, which is exceptional in having circular bokeh circles all the way out to the edge. But of course, you know, that's a $2,800 lens. So we're talking about a $275 lens and obviously a really strong performance. So I think there's a very nice blend here optically of sharpness and softness in the areas that you want. Colors are very, very good. I felt like colors were nice. You've probably seen in the outdoor segments that the rendering in the background is nice from the lens. I also found when testing for flare resistance, and I did that more on the Sony version because of the weather conditions here during the time that I was shooting with the Nikon version, but I found that flare resistance was good, except if you're like shooting right directly into the sun, which is probably not a lot of situations where you're going to do that. In most scenarios, I was very pleased with flare resistance and flare performance, but I found that it could be a little bit, particularly if you're shooting at small apertures right into the sun, probably a real-world scenario that you're not going to do very often, but if you do that, your flare resistance isn't going to be quite as good. At the end of the day, however, my conclusion is this is a really beautiful lens optically for being so inexpensive. And, you know, 85mm f2 on paper doesn't excite anyone, but when you get it in this kind of package and with this kind of performance, it's kind of exciting. My conclusion on the 85mm f2 EVO lens from Viltrox remains extremely positive here on Nikon. I feel like this is a lens that really suits a need, and certainly while the f1.8 S-line lenses from Nikon are attractive lenses in many ways, they're not necessarily inexpensive. And so you're looking at nearly $800 US for the 85 f1.8 S-line lens. And so this EVO lens, I think, provides a really intriguing budget option at only $275 US or slightly less if you use the discount code in the description down below. So that means that you can get a lens that does pretty much everything that the S-line lens can do with a little bit more physical controls for considerably less. And obviously, as we have seen, it's really optically sound. It does a lot of things well. And even when it comes to autofocus and just the general stability, it's lightweight. And yes, the maximum aperture is a third stop less bright than the Nikon lens, but I think that most people would be willing to accept that compromise for, you know, $500. So at the end of the day, I think that this is a really welcome addition to the Z-mount platform. I'm also really happy to see it come so quickly to Z-mount, whereas we've seen more of a delay when it comes to some of the more recent Viltrox releases. So I'm really glad to see this here, and I think this is going to be a lens that will be a really excellent seller here for Z-mount as well. It really feels like a very confident third-party adaptation, and it shows to me that Viltrox is growing in their ability to do Z-mount well, which is fantastic. I'm excited about that. And so at the end of the day, I am really enthusiastic about this arriving here, and it's a lens that I anticipate really enjoying using on my own Z8, and certainly an easy one to bring along on trips or when traveling because it is so compact and it is so competent at the same time. Now, if you want more information, you can either check out my full text review that is linked in the description down below. There are buying links there in the description. Check out the new DustinAbbott.net, and you're going to enjoy the text reviews that are there and lots of additional information. Beyond that, if you want a deep dive into the optical performance, as always, this is the place to get that. So stay tuned with me right now. Let's jump into it and see what we find. All right, we'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. If you see here, you can see a tiny bit of a pincushion style distortion. Very easy to correct, just a -2 here helps to straighten all of that out. No issues with that. Vignette is pronounced, but not terribly pronounced, and as noted, not really all that much worse than what it was on Sony. I used a +76 to achieve this result. There is a correction profile available, however, already, and so that does help. Now, if I turn off that profile in a real-world shot, you can see that there definitely is some darkening in the corners. I do want to point out, however, look at how great that contrast and detail is in the plane of focus. That's gorgeous. I find that chromatic aberrations are well controlled. There's minimal fringing before and after the plane of focus, whether here on the chart. And then if we punch in here and we look in the imprints here, really nice and clean. And look at all of the shiny bits. Very, very well controlled in terms of chromatic aberrations. Not really any kind of outlining of fringing here. And likewise, you can see that inside the bokeh circles, they're nice and clean looking. There is a bit of an inner line there, but it's not like terribly pronounced. As the lens stops down, you can see that there's some just wide open. There's some of that kind of lemon or cat eye shape stopping down to f2.8, and you've got fairly round specular highlights with just a little bit of deformation near the edge of the frame. Here now at f4, you can see a little bit of a nonagonal shape from the aperture blades, but basically it's circles all across the frame. So a really good result there also. Now, when it comes to lateral style chromatic aberrations, you can see a tiny bit of fringing, but this is at a really high level of magnification, nearly 200%. You're not going to really see any of this in real world shots. Now, when it comes to resolution and contrast, again, 45 megapixel Z8 sensor, and this is at 200% magnification. Center of the frame looks awesome. Great detail, great contrast. You see some moire there because contrast is so intense. I don't love moire, but it is an indicator on my test chart that you're achieving very high levels of contrast and resolution. Likewise, here you can see same thing. That's a great mid-frame performance. As we move down, you can see a fairly consistent from this upper left to the lower right corner. And as we carry on down, you can see it's still holding out pretty good here. And it's really not until you get to the very edge that resolution begins to fall off. Now, to give that some real-world perspective, here is a crop of a shot from Nala. She jumped right up while I was trying to work, and so she got in the way. For some reason, I was looking at the lights I was using to eliminate the SLR. So I took a few pictures, took advantage of it, and you can see great detail and contrast that's there. Likewise, this shot is actually through a sliding like French door, and despite having some glass in between, you can see just how much resolution and contrast there is. Really great-looking shot. Likewise, here, and this is just nice lighting. You can see the colors are really nice and clean. But again, if we look here at the fur, really nice delineation of that, very good detail. No fringing showing up in the whiskers, all good stuff. In fact, if I compare out in the real world at 100% magnification, f2 to f5.6, we can see that, yeah, there's a little bit more contrast and resolution here on the right at f5.6, but even as we pan off here towards the edge, yes, it is improved at f5.6, but it's not a night and day difference. It is already very, very good even at f2 here on the 45 megapixel sensor. So that's really, really encouraging to see. It also means for those of you that are shooting APS-C and you're considering this lens that, yeah, it's going to work fine on APS-C. There's plenty of resolution there to handle a higher pixel density. We've already seen that by testing it on Sony. So frankly, the only real area there's room for improvement is more at the corners, because most of the frame is already super sharp at f2. As we see, if we look into the corners at f2.8 here on the right, number one, they do brighten up immensely, so you can reduce a lot of that vignette by shooting at f2.8. Now we can see that contrast and resolution is looking good here. It hasn't radically improved here in the corner yet. Let's look up at the other side, and we can see that even this far in, it's really looking quite good by f2.8. But if we look in this zone here, closer to the edge, it's still a little bit softer. Moving on to f4, it's looking better, but really at f5.6, you can see that it sharpens and brightens even further. And now even you come in just a little bit, and that the blacks are just inky on that writing. All of the fine detailing here is looking really good, and this is way off in this upper corner. So that's a really great resolution performance stop down. You'll see the same through f8, and then at f11 you'll see a bit of softening due to diffraction. You see that, like, for example, that moire pattern is gone. If we look here, it's very faint compared to wide open. But at f16, you're seeing even more softening due to diffraction. But you can also see, even at 200% magnification, that's still a very usable result. So frankly, at normal 100% magnification, you would still be happy with that result. Now, as noted, you get a little bit better amount of maximum magnification relative to the S-line lens, and the up-close performance is good. I mean, the plane of focus looks nice and flat. You can see we've got resolution right off to the edge of the frame. Contrast isn't off the charts good, but certainly we're at a very usable level here looking at it at 100% magnification. Now, if we go out to the real world here, like that's a beautiful combination of sharpness and contrast, and then overall softness of rendering. You can see as we transition to defocus, no real hard edges, looking really clean. This image, I think, it shows off all the good stuff. Great resolution and contrast in the plane of focus, and then the background is nice and creamy, no issues there. I'm very happy with that end result. And even if I jump to this final image where it's obviously a very complex background that's right beyond this, while, yes, there's a little bit more edging than what I would like, and it's more than anything, it's not as defocused as what I would like. You can see that even that transition zone doesn't look terrible, and then up in this zone, we're getting into some really nice creaminess. So at the end of the day, I think that the rendering for an f2 lens is really quite nice. All right, so thanks for sticking around until the very end, and hopefully the deep dive into the optical performance has given you the answers you're looking for. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.